Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to History Week 2021 at the Australian National Maritime Museum. Thanks to the History Council of New South Wales. They've put on a fantastic program this year yet again. My name's Dr. Peter Hobbins. I have the glorious job title of Head of Knowledge at the Australian National Maritime Museum, which means that my team includes the curators, the Vaughan Evans Library, and also our publications, including our magazine Signals. We're delighted that today's History at Home event actually launches a whole series that we'll be producing and bringing out to you every Tuesday for the next few months. So come back to this spot every Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. and you will find more exciting history talks and a few quirky ones too. We'll come back and tell you about those a little bit later. The Australian National Maritime Museum acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the Bamal, which is the land, and the Badu, or water, on which we work. We also acknowledge all traditional custodians of the lands and waters throughout Australia and pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past and present. Well, this is an inaugural session in our series on History at Home, and we've got three surprising short stories of the seas for you today. You can see the presenters' names there. I'll be introducing them in turn, starting with myself. All three presenters are curators at the National Maritime Museum, and all three of us have worked with the wonderful staff at the Vaughan Evans Library as well. They've assisted us with our research, and they can do the same for you. Each presenter is going to talk for 10 minutes, and then at the end of the three talks, we'll then have 15 minutes for questions. Now, you'll see that there's a Q&A button on your screen. You're welcome to type in questions at any time. We'll gather them up at the end and share them out amongst the three presenters today. So do type them in anywhere that you go. Well, I'm up first. We often hear at the Australian National Maritime Museum about maritime traditions. And certainly they overlap with many family traditions as well, as we can see on the slide here. And I'm very pleased to say, in terms of families and home, I'm presenting to you today from my home on Gadigal land. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the centuries-old practice of naming newborns, like this charming little bub here, naming those newborns after the vessels they were born upon. And as you can see here, the captain is raising a toast to the youngster. Often captains and other senior officers were involved in christening or baptising many children on board, whether or not there was a priest present. Now, I'm going to focus mostly on the 19th century today. So if you think about it, 19th century sailing voyages to Australia or the Australian colonies usually took between 4 to 6 months, whether you were sailing from the United Kingdom and Europe, or possibly sailing across from North America, or even sailing down from Asia as well. It was a long voyage. And a typical immigrant ship like this beautiful clipper Samuel Plimsoll would often carry, say, 450 passengers. So you think about it, that's a very large number of people in a small space for a very long time. Now, surprisingly enough, travelling on a ship like this was actually much healthier than we might believe. And over the course of that 4 to 6 month journey, there would often only be a handful of deaths. But on the other hand, as you can probably imagine, there were also a few births on board during those periods as well. So to give you an example, on the inaugural voyage of Samuel Plimsoll, which left Plymouth in 1873 and arrived in Sydney in 1874, there were 2 births on board. And we can see in this diary entry from matron Mary Holly, one of those births is recorded, and I've transcribed it for you below there. And what matron Holly says is that Mrs. Bone was safely delivered of a son at 10 minutes to 4 p.m. I washed him and named him Samuel Plimsoll after the ship. Now, it's exciting for us because we hold this diary in the National Maritime Museum collection, and we also have a transcript in the Vaughan Evans Library as well. So it's a great place to start looking for stories like this one. Now, there's something ironic about the fact that this boy was named after the ship Samuel Plimsoll, because the Samuel Plimsoll was named after a man. And we're looking here at the figurehead from the ship, which still survives in Western Australia. The ship was named after Samuel Plimsoll, who was a British Member of Parliament who campaigned tirelessly for improved safety standards for British sailors. And you may sometimes hear of the Plimsoll line, which are small lines painted on the waterline of many ships to show when they're properly loaded, and also they disappear under the water when the ship is overloaded and becomes dangerous. Now, I mentioned there were 2 births on board the Samuel Plimsoll's voyage that left in 1873. So if you look down on the bottom of the screen there, you can see that Grace Bone delivered her son Samuel Plimsoll Bone on the 7th of December 1873. But Anne Shadbolt also delivered another baby that year. Now, Samuel Plimsoll Bone became a miner like his father Benjamin. Unfortunately, he didn't live very long. He made it until 1900 when he was working at a gold mine in Queensland. Unfortunately, the shaft collapsed, and although he was dug out, he died several months later in Rockhampton Hospital. On the other hand, the little girl who was born on the same voyage had a much longer life. She was named Mary Plimsoll Shadbolt, although she preferred through her life to be known as Polly. Now, Polly and her family, the Shadbolts, moved to Dubbo soon after they arrived in New South Wales. And Polly then married John Mitchell in 1893 and remained there in Dubbo for the rest of her life. We'll hear a little bit more about her again in a minute. So I guess one of the questions you're asking is, why would people name their children after a ship? In part, it is just simply a maritime tradition, and bearing in mind that the captain often did officiate at naming ceremonies, whether they were christenings, baptisms, or other ceremonies. So the captain, I guess, had a fairly important role to play there. But I think more importantly, as I said earlier on, immigration on a sailing ship was an intense communal experience. And you can see from the illustration on the right here from the 1850s, or on the reconstruction on the wonderful clipper ship in San Francisco Harbour, Balclutha, people lived in very primitive conditions throughout their sea voyage of 4 to 6 months. They were in close quarters, they got to know everybody, but they also shared the dramas and tragedies of their voyages as well. If there was wild storms, if there was a close encounter with an iceberg, if one of the masts broke, or if there was a disease outbreak and the vessel was quarantined, everybody on board knew it, and many of them remembered that experience for their entire lives. So it's not surprising that many of those travellers chose to name children born on those voyages after the ship, or sometimes after the officers on board. Now, how common was it, I hear you ask? Well, I'm glad that you did ask. Here's an example from Samuel Plimsoll and its sister ship Smyrna, which was basically of a similar design, built by the same company and operated by the same shipping line, sailing from England to Australia in the 1870s and 1880s. And you can see there that over the course of those voyages, 9 children were named after Samuel Plimsoll in one form or another, and 3 also had the name Smyrna in their names as well. So that, I think, helps put it into context that many of these voyages did produce several children named after the ship they were on. Now, the context was important, though, as well, in thinking about how they were named. So to give you an example, if we look at the 1882 entry, we can see that the 3rd boy named after the ship, Samuel Plimsoll Bowden Carter, has a 3rd name. Now, interestingly enough, the captain of Samuel Plimsoll was named Richard Bowden. It was spelled B-O-A-D-E-N. So I suspect that this was just one immigrant family's slightly misspelled attempt to make a tribute not only to the vessel, but also to the captain on board. So you've got to keep an eye out for these sorts of additional details when you're researching families like this. Now, the close-eyed amongst you will have also spotted one odd name out. Can the rest of you see it now? Have a bit of a zoom into the 1879 entry, Mary Quarantine Chapman. As far as I can tell, that's a unique middle name in New South Wales anywhere in the 19th century. Mary was on board Samuel Plimsoll. Well, actually, she wasn't. Her parents were on board Samuel Plimsoll in 1879. She was born soon after they came ashore at North Head Quarantine Station, hence her unique middle name. Keep your eyes open for these interesting and unexpected links. So for all of the children like this, you could say that in fact their name becomes part of a lifelong voyage that commemorates the vessel that they were born on. So we heard earlier about Mary Plimsoll Shadbolt, who lived in Dubbo. Well, she survived until 1936. And you can see here that her grave was recorded at that time at Macquarie Park Cemetery in North Sydney. Very proudly emblazoned on her headstone is Mary Plimsoll. On the other hand, an even more prominent message passed down through the generations in the Smellie family. So Thomas and Margaret Smellie arrived in Sydney aboard Smyrna in 1878. they moved to Penrith, where they named their house Smyrna. And in fact, that house name remained until the house was demolished in 1970. They also had a son born on board that voyage, William Smyrna Smalley. His brother Tom was born in Penrith a few years after they arrived. Tom had a boy named Darcy, and he gave Darcy the middle name Smyrna. Now, Darcy survived until 2004. So you can see that, in fact, a voyage from 1878 was perpetuated down through not only the name of the house, but through one of their children for close to 130 years after that voyage. Now, as with any research that you do, you need to be triangulating and cross-checking your records. I've given a range of possible sources to be thinking about here, but do think about not only the name of the ship and variations on it, but also have a look for the name of the captain, for the senior officers on board, as well as the surgeon superintendent, who was a very important figure on the ship. And do think about the children of the children born on board the ship too. To give you another example, Thomas Plimsoll Alsop was born on the Samuel Plimsoll in 1876. He survived until 1967. Thomas had a son named Marshall, who also had the middle name Plimsoll. But unfortunately, Marshall Plimsoll Alsop died in a crash of a Royal Australian Air Force plane in 1938. So in fact, his father outlived him and was the longest lived of all the children named after the Samuel Plimsoll ship. Own voyage, think about some of the fabulous resources that we put on the screen there. If you want to know more about this story, I have this piece is coming out in an article in the next issue of Traces magazine. It'll be in newsagents in a couple of weeks' time. But also contact the Australian National Maritime Museum, speak to the team in our Vaughan Evans Library, and they can help you on your own research voyage. And do remember, if you've got questions for myself or the other presenters, pop them in the Q&A box that you should see on your screen now. Well, that wraps up my presentation. I'm now delighted to invite a very different sort of presentation, one that focuses on costumes and business history. And our presenter for this session will be Inga Scheel, who's an associate curator at the museum. She will just be bringing up her slides now. Inga is not only a world expert on the Titanic, but she's also a vintage fashion collector who has, she tells us, about 1,100 vintage gowns in her collection. So she's going to talk to us today about the enterprising career of Australian swimmer Annette Kellerman. Over to you, Inga.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, Peter. As you say, I'm an assistant curator here at the National Maritime Museum, and I'd just like to start my talk by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you with, the Darug people. Now, I'm here to talk to you today about one of my favourite items in the collection. We have quite a few. For a maritime museum, we actually have quite a few costume pieces, not just swimsuits, but we have 1930s gowns, with not just uniforms, but we have outfits worn on board ship and worn by immigrants coming to the country. But this particular outfit is one associated with one of Australia's most colourful characters of the early 20th century. And she may be familiar to some of you. Annette Kellerman, of course, was, it's very hard to summarise her career because she performed in so many fields. She started as a competitive champion swimmer in Australia. She then moved to London and then on to into the UK and then on to America, where she excelled in not only feats of sporting prowess, like attempting to swim the English Channel. She got 3/4 of the way across. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it. She said her endurance was strong, but unfortunately the brute strength required by the feat defeated her. But she also then moved on to make her way in vaudeville and was one of our first silent film screen stars. But I'm concentrating on one little niche area of her career, and one in which she is quite, which she won renown and for which she is respected today. If you look up any history of swimsuit evolution, there's an incident in 1907, or alternatively, sometimes the date is given as 1908, on Paul Revere Beach in Boston. And it is claimed that a very young and innocent Annette, by her own account, training for a competitive event, turned up at the beach in a one-piece swimsuit. Now, what we see there on the left, an item from our collection here at the Maritime Museum, this is a handmade swimsuit. This is actually one of the more daring ones of the early 20th century. There were actually more voluminous skirts worn and even bigger pantaloons. It was also the accepted practice that you wore stockings and bathing shoes when you swam. Now, the story goes, as it's immortalised in the 1952 $1 Million Mermaid movie, Annette was arrested for indecent exposure on the beach. All before a judge, she made the argument that modesty was overridden by the safety concern, and she made an impassioned plea: how many more women will need to die before we can actually wear sensible bathing suits? And the judge agrees with her in the end and tells her she can just sew some tights onto her swimsuit, and she leaves to great acclaim, and it is publicised all over the nation. And there's a wonderful scene there with the flashing headlines of, you know, Annette Kellerman wins in court, etc. Now, there's one slight problem with this, and that is that it probably never happened. My colleague, Dana Fletcher, did extensive research in American archives some years ago, in which she could find no record, let alone a nationwide write-up or nationwide coverage. And I know that other Australian collecting institutions have reached the same conclusion. It's a wonderful story, but it probably never happened. You can see, however, that Annette Kellerman did have a brush with the law. That article I've popped up there is from 1909, and she was arrested for speeding. I suspect that what happened is a conflation of Annette's actual appearance before the courts and before the judge and the events that we're about to see unfold in the 1920s. And by the early 1930s, which is when the arrest on Port Revere Beach is, when she first starts incorporating it into her life story, I suspect she's conflated the two and come up with what's really a very vivid image, a very vivid story about how revolutionary these one-piece swimsuits were. It might not be literal truth, but there's a certain veracity in terms of the impact that the one-piece suit has. So what actually happened? Well, we see there Annette in Punch in Australia in 1904, and she's wearing a men's one-piece swimsuit. As you notice, there are bare legs, no stockings. She swam the Yarra the Yarra River down in Melbourne in this costume. She was persuaded, for reasons of modesty, to sew stockings on some occasions. And the reason I've put that image up there on the left, it's a very well-known image of Annette, probably circa 1905, I'd say, when she moved to London and then on to the US. You can see she's got a very Gibson Girl hairstyle, so it's obviously early 1900s. And you can see the differentiation between the swimsuit and the stockings. She's modified her outfit for purposes of modesty. By 1912, this is in, say, 1905 to 1907, 1908, she is making many appearances in the American media. She's becoming famous as a vaudeville star. She's left some of the competitive swimming behind. And by 1910, she was appearing in silent film. You can see that by 1912, their one-piece swimsuit, controversial in its day, is already becoming associated with the Annette Kellerman name. She's also writing syndicated newspaper columns, and she may not have been the first person to wear the one-piece swimsuit. This is very difficult to establish at this distance, but she was certainly one of the first to popularise it. And she advocated very much for the necessity of discarding some of those voluminous skirts as a health. It wasn't so much a modesty issue for her, it was more a safety issue. And that was what a lot of these early women advocating for swimsuit reform, the line that they pushed in order to advocate for much more practical swimwear. And you can see by 1913, it's starting to enter popular consciousness. We've got a lovely issue of Puck magazine with a very sporty young woman. Now, the the cover has focused very much on the visual appeal and the nubile young woman and so on and so forth. But you can also see the contrast between the attire worn in the background, women that are wearing full-length body tights as well as voluminous skirts, and the one-piece suit. And you can imagine what was much more practical. We tend to think of the 1920s as the transition point into modern dress, but the origins of it are much earlier in the century. And by 1913, we're starting to look towards more modern swimsuits. Now, Annette Kellerman was nothing if not an excellent self-promoter, and she had an interest in fashion. We already see by the early 1910s, she's designing not just swimsuits, she's also appearing in newspapers promoting dress, costume, coats, hats even. She also was an early celebrity endorsement proponent, and you can see there in the Washington Herald article from 1916, this was when she was promoting her film, Daughter of the Gods. Now, she doesn't really wear any shoes or boots in that film. She's very much, most of her early silent films were very much nautically inspired. She plays a mermaid, she plays a nubile young woman swimming in the sea. She doesn't wear lovely high-top boots like we see there. However, in spite of the fact that the connection is very tenuous, she was certainly not adverse to lending her name to promoting it. And so we see her there in a shoe advertisement. But she had also very much identified and already had an interest in her own line of swimwear. And in 1914, we see that she starts working with a chap called Leonard C. Ashe, who is the owner of Asbury Mills in New York. And he too is seeing a business opportunity. And they patent the swimming tights in 1914. That's the filing in the official United States Patent Gazette. And by the end of the decade, as we see in this advertisement here on the right, she is promoting several types of swimming attire. So we have the swimming tights, which is the one piece. What we think of today when we talk about the Annette Kellerman swimsuit, we think of a one-piece suit. But she's also advocating, as you can see in that article from the Capital News, she realised that not everyone was willing to embrace a one-piece swimsuit, given that the overdress was still one of the predominant forms of swimwear. So she, as she puts it in this, this is one of her syndicated columns, of course, I do not ask you to wear the one-piece suit, but you should all wear what is called the two-piece boy suit. In fact, I request you to wear this kind of suit if you wish to be safe at all in the water. Again, the advocates of women's reform in swimwear were very much pushing the point of view that it was a safety hazard to be wearing too many clothes in the water. And so now we come to the collection, and here we have this absolutely lovely, I'll just actually go back one moment. I'll just highlight the fact that you have the swimming tights, which is the one piece, and also the two-in-one suits, which is what she also calls the boyish two-in-white, and the slip-on suits, which went over. And so now in the National Maritime Collection, we have the slip-on suit, which we see at the left, which is still harkening back to those more voluminous Edwardian gowns we saw earlier. But you can see it's much more abbreviated. It's much shorter sleeves, and the skirt would only go to just below hip length. Now, this was worn over the type of swimsuit we see there in the middle, which is the classic one-piece. These are separate pieces. So you could wear just the swimming tights, the one-piece, or if you needed additional modesty, you had the slip-on suit. Now, the boyish two-in-one, or as they soon dropped the idea that it was the boy's suit and it just became the two-in-one, is the one we see there on the right. And this combines the two elements. It's both the overdress, which is now integrated into the tights. The tights could be a lot longer. This one, these two are from a private collection there on the right. And that second one would date to later in the decade. The earliest versions of this were nearly to the knees, and the skirt would come about halfway or lower on the thigh. And looking at Annette Kellerman labels, again, we've got the earlier label up there, which probably dates to around when the patent was introduced in 1914. You can see it's swimming tights, and we have a depiction of Annette there wearing these very modest tights going all the way down to the knee. Now, the later one, patent for the 2-in-1, which was introduced in 1917, you can see that it's higher up the thighs and also has a sporty little belt. She's also wearing some very nice swimming shoes, I noticed too. Now, we reached the flashpoint with women's fashion in 1921 and 1922. Already there was that push for modernity, and we've seen through the Puck magazine cover that there was conflict about what these outfits represented. There's already a conflict between safety and modesty. By 1921 and 1922, America is really facing up to a changing culture. You would be familiar with the idea of 1920s fashion and more loose-fitting forms and an ease of movement that was expected in dress. And that translates also into swimsuits. But in 1921 and 1922, you have ordinances over the United States that differ. We had a similar situation here, I might add, in Australia, where local ordinances not only differed from council to council, but you also had what was put into practice and what was actually on the books. Now, you had some areas where, as we see there in Washington, DC, the expected length from the bottom of the swimsuit to the knee was 6 inches. Chicago on the right there was far more conservative. I think there was a 2-inch limit there to how long the swimsuit can be. Now, have a look at the 2-in-1 that the girl that is being arrested is wearing, and you can imagine the resistance to that. In some areas, you were also expected to wear tights that went over your knees, and women would attend the beach, roll them down, so they had mostly bare legs, but their tights were rolled down around the knees. There's all stockings. And the beach censors, like that gentleman there on the left, would come around and tell them, roll them up, sister, to guard modesty. But what was happening was women were pushing back at that ground root level, and their lived experience was very different to what was on the books. And there was a lot of resistance. They had access to media. They could read in newspapers about places like California and Florida and see photos, because newspapers were publishing more photographs taken on location rather than sketches or just newsprint. And they could see what women were wearing in other parts of the country, and they wanted to embrace that. However, by this stage, the one-piece suit, which was considered entirely immodest, you can imagine what a very thin knit when wet. It might be made of wool, but it could be very form-fitting and left very little to the imagination. And so these had become genericized by this point. Genericization is, of course, when a label becomes synonymous with a product. Kleenex is one of the most commonly given examples. And so by this stage, the Annette Kellerman has become the generic term for a one-piece swimsuit. And so we have what we see there in 1921. Some city ordinances are decreeing that Annette Kellerman swimsuits could not be worn. And so Annette was nothing, as I said before, was nothing if not an excellent self-promoter. And she realised that she was narrowing the brand. And so in spite of the fact that today, what we think of as the Annette Kellerman is that lovely, and that is a Annette Kellerman branded swimsuit there on the left, worn by one of our wonderful teacher guides at the museum, Katrina. She would later in life embrace that, but at the time there was a pushback, and she wanted to diversify. As we've seen, the Annette Kellerman label was not only the one-piece swimsuit, it also involved the 2-in-1 and the slip-over suit in many colours and forms. And so we see this article where Annette, in spite of the fact that they were promoting the swimsuit reviews and the costumes, and they were at the heart of the controversy in places like Atlantic City, we start to see Annette insisting that they're not only, her swimsuit label is not only one-piece suits. And I don't think it's any denigration to Annette to say that it's a bit of a triumph that unfortunately she failed in trying to insist that it was merely a label. It will forever be associated with the one-piece swimsuit, which was the truly revolutionary piece that started freeing up women for swimming. And as someone who has worn, if not an Annette Kellerman labelled swimsuit, I have certainly worn swimsuits from that era. And the first thing people ask me is it not heavy to swim in wool or cotton? And while they may not have the elasticity of modern materials such as Lycra, it's actually not that difficult to swim in an Annette Kellerman piece. It very much conforms to you. It sucks in. The main difficulty with wearing a woolen swimsuit or a cotton swimsuit like that is in the drying out process. It's when you leave the water. So you can imagine, it's very easy to imagine having left behind bathing shoes and stockings and voluminous skirts that reach to your knees or below, what a difference it made. Now, this is part of a dialogue about swimwear that continues to this day. The Annette Kellerman swimsuit design that won out, however, in the 1920s was the two-in-one. That dominated all the way into the 30s. But in many ways, we're still continuing the conversations that Annette participated in about modesty versus functionality, and what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate, and what enables you to actually fully participate in ocean-going sports. And now I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, David O'Sullivan. Now, David, this is exploring a very different and set of the diverse sources that we have at the Vaughan Evans Library. And David has a background in radio and interviews, and I know he's had the assistance of our librarian, Karen Pimble, in preparing this talk. So I'll hand it over to you, David.
Thanks for that, Inga, and really enjoyed the talk. And my name is David O'Sullivan, so I'm curator of historic vessels here at the Maritime Museum. And I'd like to begin by just recognising that I'm speaking on Wongal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders both past and present, and also recognise that sovereignty is not ceded. So, buried within the vast catalogue at the Vaughan Evans Library lies a really interesting set of oral histories that speak towards the development of the nation of Timor-Leste. These intertwined narratives speak towards periods of conflict, isolation, and renewal. Approaching the 20th anniversary of the young nation next year, they act as an important reminder and poignant reminder to think about the complex set of relationships that tie Australia and East Timor. And furthermore, they act as a really cool example to draw you guys to great assets of the Vaughan Evans Library. So, John Paddy Keneally, an Irish immigrant, was a wharf labourer in Darwin when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Even though in a reserved occupation at the time, with his dockwork considered essential to the war effort, he did join the army and became part of the famous Sparrow Force. And then he landed in Dili in January of 1942 with the 2nd Commando Squadron. East Timor at the time was a neutral Portuguese territory, the Australians landing on the presumption of a Japanese invasion, which later occurred on the 19th of February 1942. Upon invasion, the 2nd Commando Squadron fled to the Timorese mountains and began a period of really guerrilla warfare with the Japanese army. Keneally here reflects upon the nature of conflict at the time.
We were up against 3 battalions of Japanese troops. They had mortars, mountain artillery. Their air force bombed all the mountain townships and machine gunned them. And as they came through, particularly the ones from Dili, they burnt the villages, killed off the livestock and destroyed the crops, because they knew the only reason we were existing in the mountains was because of the Timorese and the Portuguese supporting us. And I suppose their intention was, if we can't drive them out of the mountains, we'll starve them out of the mountains. Well, that offensive went on from about the 8th of August till the 18th, about 10 or 12 days it went on. and we were in a pretty desperate position at the time.
As a veteran, Keneally was an ardent supporter of East Timorese independence. His unit's survival during the war pretty much contingent on the support of the local East Timorese. Here he talks to that camaraderie experience between the two nations at the time.
But it was the Timorese that carried the wounded. Now, we had no criadas or anything like that up to that date, but they carried the wounded, and they went out, they finished up out near Aramera at a place called Haifu, coffee plantation. Now, that was the first meal they had for 2.5 to 3 days. And they were carrying their wounded and moving at night time, but it was the Timorese that guided them, the Timorese that carried.
Many decades later, in 1975, Natalina Ramos Felipe Horta fled to the same mountain region following the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. Here she lived a life of exile for 3 years. She recalls her memories of leaving Dili at the time.
The Indonesians came in the night, in the afternoon, and in the night. The next morning they all took off, went to the mountains. Everybody in Dili, they went out.
So governador o autoridade palma hele palácio governo
only the people in the government, like the governor and all those people who were in the government stayed in Dili. Because if they didn't, they will gather them all up and send them to a concentration camp in Likisa.
Natalina would eventually migrate to Australia in 1989, motivated by a safe future for her children. She was pivotal in the East Timorese independence movement, a supporter of the Revolutionary Fretilin Party and mother to the famous Jose Ramos Horta. In Australia, in Sydney, her house became somewhat of a gathering spot for the local advocates and the local supporters for East Timorese independence. Here she reflects upon her house and the climate at the time.
Yes, this house has been like that. I mean, when Jose is here, everybody comes here. When it's meetings, and tambasira rona dia umedene has fatingida ke emasirbe has Jeff sirne dem mai hene hetama. The house is an open house to everyone that works for the Timorese cause. Yeah. So
às vezes você telefone mais russo Zé, eu não nem lá ia lugar tem nem bolo mobile.
Also it's like a base for Jose, and sometimes people rings here to find whether Jose is here or not. So
Chris Eleanor was one such Australian who was involved in the movement following Indonesian invasion in 1975. He participated in a mission to transmit coded radio signals between East Timorese guerrilla forces in the mountains and their government in exile, often in very difficult terrain in the Northern Territory. That entire movement at the time of radio transmission was made famous by Brian Manning, who allowed, I guess, a connection and a link between Australian politicians and Australian journalists to East Timorese advocates in the mountains. Here, Chris Eleanor talks about the specifics of his quite dangerous operation at the time.
The key issue up there in the wet season is getting in and out, because a lot of the country is just about inaccessible. There's a whole heap of old airfields which were put in by the Americans in the Second World War, and there's still hard stand roads into them, and there's still the remains of the tarmac. The point being that the tarmac actually gives you a clearing in the jungle or in the bush, which allows you to get the signal out. So provided you can find a high enough tree and you can get the aerial line the right way, you could use these sites and get out of them. So I operated from this place and received the calls there. So stuff that was coming in, there was a schedule for those, and I received those. To actually transmit, I'd use one of these 20 or 30 sites that I'd identified. I'd drive out there in advance, mix up which roads I went out of Darwin, which ones I came back, what times I went in and what time I went out. Sometimes I'd go out for 1 day, sometimes 3 or 4 days. And so the way I re-established contact was to go to one of these sites and to break in over one of the broadcasts that was still coming out of East Timor. And there was just like this stunned silence at the other end. And I did it again. And then there was a response. So we very quickly set up days and times when I would transmit and they should be receiving. And they told me the times they would be transmitting and I should be receiving. So with that, closed down communications, put it all back in the secret box and drove like hell for 80 kilometres or so. So
the stories of Chris, Natalina and Paddy are just a sample of the many different resources, oral histories, books, journals at the Vaughan Evans Library. and available to everyone, of course. So I thought I'd just give a brief overview of Vaughan Evans. Vaughan was born in 1924. He was one of the founders of the Australian Association for Maritime History. He served in the Royal Navy during the war and emigrated to Australia in 1955. Whilst committee chairman a bit later on of the 1975 Pigott Inquiry into National Collections, Vaughan's argued for a National Museum of the Sea to be built in Sydney. Together with Professor Peter Spirit, he co-authored the museum's draft collection policy once the government had committed to fund the museum. Vaughan donated his extensive personal library of classic and rare maritime history publications, which became the nucleus of the library's growing collection. Now in its 35th year, the library was the first of the museum's facilities to serve the Australian public and private researchers. So I thought now, rounding off my presentation, I'd just show you guys a brief guide of how to access some of the oral histories at the Vaughan Evans Library and also the rest of the collection. So if you just jump to the main museum website, you just need to go up to the Collections tab, then head down to Library, and then just scroll a bit down the page, and then you can search the catalogue via this View Now tab. Here you can browse via Collections, and then over here you see a tab that says Oral Histories, where you can browse alphabetically for anyone's name. And I've just got here, I'm going to search for Chris's oral history. So if we go to E to Eleanor, and that's where Chris's will be. So you can browse there for anyone, lots of very interesting stories to behold there. So, and that pretty much rounds up my talk today.
Well, thank you, David. So we're really excited now that we've had a series of questions come in. We're going to open it up to further questions as well. So again, just a reminder, use the Q&A little set of speaking boxes there that you can type into. And just a reminder, our presenters were myself, Dr. Peter Hobbins, then we were followed by Inga Shiel and David O'Sullivan. So if you want to direct a question to an individual, please do. And also remember that after this session's over, you're welcome to send your messages and questions to the Vaughan Evans Library team as well. Now, the questions that have come in so far, there's a range of really interesting ones. So there's a couple that began with my presentation on naming children after ships. So Lee has written in to say her great-grandmother was born on the SS Oriental, which arrived in New Zealand in 1841. Needless to say, she was named Caroline Oriental. And similarly, Bob has written in to say James Alexander C. Mackenzie, SEA Mackenzie, was born on the ship SEA in March 1853 on the way to Melbourne as a government immigrant. He was named James after the captain, James Mackay, and while Alexander was a family name and C was named after the ship. So sometimes you've got to actually go to the family stories as well as any journals or diaries on board, in addition to the genealogical work that you might be doing there. Now, Robert Hetherington actually asked us two questions, both for Inga. So I'll leap in here. Firstly, he asks, do you have original costumes, clothing in the collection, which is something Inga did address, but he also asks, how do you store and preserve them, and are there any currently on display? And if I can just pop in another part of his question, did the UK follow Kellerman's fashion? So a few things in there.
Thanks, Peter, and good questions, Robert. Yes, we have two specifically branded Annette Kellerman costumes in the collection. They're actually in different parts of the collection. One is the slip-over suit worn over the swimming tights that I used in the presentation. And the other is actually in a part of the collection that I think we would love to introduce to a wider audience, our education collection. And that one's fascinating because it's actually a child's swimsuit. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get into the museum to organise to have a good, clear photo taken of it because we're in lockdown, and I'm hoping to do that in the near future. But Annette Kellerman didn't just do adult women's costumes. She also did swimsuits for children and toddlers. And this is a lovely little colourful costume that I look forward to sharing. But the museum's education collection is part of teaching tools. These are pieces of the collection that can be shared and touched and are used to introduce concepts to our younger audiences and older as well. And there's a wonderful swimsuit collection associated with the education collection, of which the child Annette Kellerman costume is just one part. We've actually used them in the past for our historic swimsuit parade at the Classic and Wooden Boat Festival. Neither of the pieces are currently on display. The Annette Kellerman swimsuit for the adult one was last displayed. I think we had a wonderful exhibition in 2009 called Exposed, and that inspired. We held a challenge with some of Australia's leading swimsuit designers of the time called the Woolen Mermaid, and they created these wonderful one-piece woolen swimsuits as a homage to Annette's designs. We do cycle objects in and out of displays, so no doubt we'll see it again soon. But in the meantime, it is available on the museum's collection website, so you can see not just what I showed in my presentation, which is the slip-on outer suit, but you can also see the swimming tights that went under it. And on the second part of your collection, that's actually an interesting one, because while broadly Australia, Europe, including England, and the US followed the same trends, there were a lot of nuances between locations. So it's very hard, unless you identify a specific location at a specific date, what was actually worn. The Kellerman swimsuit, when she wore it first to the US, there are articles referring to it as the continental swimsuit, even though she had obviously worn it in Australia quite early in 1904. But even in Australia in 1904, the one-piece swimsuit was not what most women were wearing at the beach. They were still wearing the more elaborate overdress and the stockings and so forth. Same with Europe. It depended on where you were in Europe. If you were, for example, on a beach in the French Riviera, in Deauville or somewhere like that, you might wear one of the more abbreviated swimsuits, the one-pieces or even the two-in-ones. In more conservative areas or ones with more conservative ordinances, you might not wear that. So it's very much a local question. But broadly speaking, yes, you can see concurrence between America, Europe, including the UK and Australia. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Inga. Now, Mina, who's a great advocate for community history, hi Mina, has sent us a question for David. She says, this is a fascinating oral history collection. Roughly how many oral history collections are there in the museum's holdings? And maybe, David, you might want to answer a little bit more about what sort of how we might break that down, what sorts of stories are in there as well.
Oh, you're right, Pete. That's a fantastic question, and thanks for sharing that too. I think the real strength and stronghold to our oral history collection at the museum lies in the migrant stories. So we have a vast range of stories of people, fleeing countries of political turmoil, fleeing, periods of conflict, and just, consciously choosing to immigrate to Australia. In terms of amounts, we've got about 150 in the Vaughan Evans Library collection, and we're actually going through a process of integrating other oral histories to our museum collection, to differing objects and stuff. So the strengths are, multiple. I would see, like we also have a lot of oral histories to do with the RAN, dating back to Australia Station to the Sabron, which was a naval training school for younger men, and more recently we went through a very extensive process of recording oral histories with RAN that were involved in the 2019-20 bushfire rescue operation as well. So it's a very much an evolving, growing thing. But at the moment, the repository for all those oral histories is at the Vaughan Evans Library, but we're looking to integrate that further with a lot of digital outreach and a museum collection, as I said, because I think it's just a fantastic way to animate the collection and bring people's stories to life. So I hope that goes some way of answering your question. It was a bit of a roundabout answer.
Great, thanks, David. Natalie, hey Natalie, how you doing? She sends in a question to me. Were the names of children born on a ship engraved on the bell, or is this only a Navy tradition, with children born off the ship to sailors on board having their names engraved? It's a great question, and look, to my knowledge, it's mostly a Royal Navy tradition, but it was also adopted by the US Navy as well. I haven't seen any examples of civilian ship's bells, or I haven't read any accounts of that happening. It's not to say it didn't, but it does sound more like it's a naval tradition. Now we have an anonymous question, but an interesting one for Inga here. The arrest in Chicago image is so dramatic that it looks staged. Is it a real capture of live action?
That's a very good question. I think some of you might be familiar with some of the 1960s images of beach censors at work on Australian beaches. And of course, it's a never-ending fascination with this subject of beach censorship. And we see it also with the other image there that I put up, which is the beach censor in the Washington, D.C. area. In the tidal basin there, measuring, holding up very obviously that's not a slice of life. It's very staged. I think a lot of these images, and in the first instance, no, I don't know whether that is actually a capture. Photography could certainly have the capacity to capture those images at the time, but whether or not it's a theatrical thing, whether or not it was staged for the cameras, newspapers did reenactments, they dramatized. I would not be willing to say whether or not it is actually an arrest in progress. But certainly this is part of the interplay that goes on between the media and the public and newspapers of the time as to how you depict these incidents. Often it was a lot more blunt and sordid. You had there were beach censors that were appointed. There was a woman, for example, in Chicago that would go around and she had sewing equipment with her and would cajole women into, that armhole is a little bit wide. Why don't I just sew it up a little bit, darling? And that the latest thing in swimwear is our skirts are worn a bit longer. So I'll just quickly tack this onto you today. And then, when you get home, you can just run a sewing machine through that hemline. So the short answer is no, we don't know. And I strongly suspect that they could be staged for the media, but they certainly dramatized the kind of conflicts that were going on the beaches. There were arrests for public indecency. There were people confronted on the beach by beach censors, but a lot of it was a lot less dramatic than those images that I used to illustrate the talk. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Inga. Well, we've got another one here for David from Graham, and we've got about 5 minutes left for questions, so do get them in. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll certainly share what we can. So, David, Graham asks, can we access the Vaughan Evans Library online? I think what he means to say now is to hear some of the oral histories and to read maritime articles. Yeah, so at the moment, we're actually trying to go through the process of digitizing a lot of the oral histories. So at present, some of them not all of them are available to playback online. So, but with the Vaughan Evans Library team, I'm working through this kind of a project to actually make them more digitally accessible to everyone so they can be played, accessed and listened to online. A lot of other articles and stuff can be searched through the repository, and I do encourage everyone to reach out to the team because they're very helpful with inquiries and accessing material that might be of interest. So long to short answer is some of the oral histories aren't available online at present. However, we are going through a process and I personally do want to enact that over the next 6 months to really hopefully make them more engaging and more accessible from home. Great, thank you, David. Now, the nerdy historian has asked a question of me. Was the culture of naming babies of ships practiced more by a particular group of migrants, such as those originating from Britain, or was it universal? I'm not actually sure about that, actually. Certainly the records that I've looked through, particularly looking at the Samuel Kunsthal and Smyrna, were obviously mostly British migrants. So they were the ones where I really found the answers. I haven't seen evidence in other cultures, although certainly it clearly happened in the United States as well. So I don't know whether other language groups were more prone to do that. For instance, when I did look up the name, for instance, Smyrna is actually a port in Turkey, and I didn't find any other names for Smyrna of different migrant groups when I was looking through the 19th century record. So that's one for me to answer, but I can't give you any more guidance now. Now we have a couple more. We might take two more and then we'll start wrapping up. Sue asks Inga, were Kellerman swimsuits devoid of adornment, and was this the norm?
I can see that the swimsuits I put up are very, very much plain Janes. There is a certain preponderance of 1910s and 1920s swimsuits that are quite dark. In fact, I had to lighten the images when I put them into the presentation. Just you had to use a lot of contrast to try and bring up some of the details. While most of the swimsuits we had were, you know, a dark navy or a charcoal grey or a black, and of course some fading has occurred, even though they attempted to make them colour fast. You can see that there's fading inevitably when you're exposed to salt water and sun. It happens. But she also did do much more colourful swimsuits. In terms of adornment, not so much, just by virtue of the fact that these were meant to be functional swimsuits, whereas, of course, by the 1930s, you're starting to make them more decorative, introduce more decorative elements for lounging by the pool. And, of course, Annette herself had fantastic stage costumes that were very elaborate. But there was certainly much more colour and form than I've used in my presentation. They tend to be rarer survivors, but you know, by the early 1930s, when Annette was still in business, she had plaid swimsuits, for example. Jean Petot, who was working in France on developing colour-fast designs that retain their shape, because these are the issues you face when you're working with wool. He introduced a lot of very colourful swimsuits and tried to alleviate that kind of idea of them just being this very black form-fitting wool outfit. So the short answer is not so much adornment, but certainly a lot more colour and form was available, even if it's a bit like cars, you know, a lot of people go towards, you know, your white or your black car today, but there's a lot more variety out there, and there certainly was a lot more variety in swimwear.
Thank you, Inga. And one last question for David. They're really neatly balanced between the panelists here. David, do you have oral histories of child migrants, and is the description of oral histories searchable?
So yeah, that's a great question. Actually, we do have a couple of really interesting oral histories done with post World War II child migrants coming from the UK to Fairbridge, which is in central west New South Wales. So I do encourage you to go on to the Vaughan Evans website and search for those. And if not, you can shoot an email to the head librarian and she'll be able to help you with I think there's 2 or 3 recordings of child migrants. So, and in terms of access, I think the slides we have had up today will be of use, and if not, you can just shoot an email onto our librarian team and they'll be able to help you with accessing any recordings you might wish to have a listen to. So thanks, Peter.
Great, thank you everybody for such great questions. They kept us all thinking and responding. So we're coming up to the hour. Just a quick plug for next week. It's going to be somewhat different format. You get me back again. Apologies for that, but I'll be giving a presentation on the historical aspects of quarantine, and then I'll be in conversation with a current day epidemiologist, Associate Professor David Muscatello, to answer this vexed question that's on everybody's lips at the moment: does quarantine really work? So do come back for that. And really, this week and next week are just part of a long series that we've got. Here's future events in the series of History at Home talks. Jump onto our website at c.museum/history@home for more details as they come up, including information. You can see some of the talks on here, but we've also got a couple of really fun sessions, including a virtual rum tasting, and wait for it, the Antiques Boat Show, where you get to share your treasures with us too. So do stay tuned. I'd love to thank all of you out there in the audience for sticking with us. I saw there were well over 100 people here, so thank you for your support. Thanks to my colleagues at the museum behind the scenes as well as on camera, and also to the History Council of New South Wales for putting on History Week 2021. Thank you again, and we'll see you all next time. Cheers.